Across social media this week, one headline spread faster than almost anything else. Canada had supposedly solved the Cusma puzzle, while the United States came away with nothing. It is an appealing narrative, but it does not accurately describe what took place on July 1st, 2026. The difference between that headline and the actual legal outcome reveals how easily trade negotiations become oversimplified once they are turned into online content. To understand what happened, it is necessary to examine what the Free Trade Commission actually accomplished during its virtual meeting, because the legal process matters far more than the public mood. According to Article 34.7 of the Canada, United States, Mexico Agreement, all three governments were obligated to meet on the 6th anniversary of the agreement entering into force. The purpose was to conduct what the treaty defines as a joint review. This gathering was never intended to reopen negotiations, nor was it the hard deadline many reports suggested. Instead, it was a scheduled checkpoint built into the agreement itself when it was signed in 2020. Often described as a sunset provision, it requires Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City to formally decide every 6 years whether they wish to continue the agreement for another 16 years. If every participant confirms its support, the agreement automatically extends through 2042, allowing normal trade to continue without interruption. If even one country refuses to provide that confirmation, the agreement does not end. It remains active but shifts into another phase. That next phase consists of yearly reviews throughout the remaining portion of the original 16-year term, continuing until 2036, unless an extension is eventually approved before then. That is exactly what occurred. On July 1st, Ambassador Jameson Greer, serving as the United States Trade Representative, released a statement that quickly attracted widespread attention because of its direct wording. The statement clearly declared that the United States did not support renewing the agreement in its current form. Consequently, using the agency's own language, the agreement was not renewed. However, anyone reading beyond the opening sentence found a more nuanced position. The same announcement explained that the agreement remains fully effective while unresolved issues are addressed, and Washington intends to continue discussions with both Canada and Mexico regarding what it described as continuing trade deficits. That position is much more complex than simply saying Canada prevailed or the United States abandoned the process. Anyone relying only on headlines likely missed the information that will actually influence Canadian exporters over the coming year. Canada, for its part, had hoped for a different result. That important detail is often absent from the more celebratory coverage. 1 month before the review, on June 1st, Minister Dominic LeBlanc delivered a formal letter to Ambassador Greer and to Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, outlining Canada's proposals for the joint review. Legal analysis published by White and Case LLP concluded that the letter demonstrated Canada's support for a complete 16-year extension. In other words, Ottawa entered the July 1st meeting expecting the straightforward renewal that ultimately did not happen. Following the trilateral meeting, LeBlanc issued a carefully measured statement instead of declaring victory. He emphasized that all three countries agreed on the importance of continuing discussions. He also identified Canada's immediate objective with complete clarity. That priority was meaningful negotiations with the United States regarding the sectoral tariffs that continue affecting Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber. Those are not the words of a government celebrating a decisive breakthrough. Instead, they reflect a government adapting after its preferred outcome failed to materialize and preparing for a longer and more complicated negotiating process. Understanding why the review failed to produce a clean extension is important because Washington's explanation adds context that disappears in brief online summaries. During a background briefing reported by CBC News, a senior Trump administration official highlighted a clear distinction between Canada's position and Mexico's. According to that official, Mexico has understood the administration's tariff strategy and has generally taken a constructive approach. Canada, by contrast, was described as having failed to adequately address what Washington considers non-tariff barriers, along with other trade concerns already raised by the United States. Whether that assessment is viewed as fair or not is beside the point. It currently represents the reasoning guiding the American negotiating position, and it explains why negotiations involving Canada and Mexico are no longer advancing along identical paths. The third round of bilateral discussions between the United States and Mexico had already been scheduled for the week of July 20th in Mexico City. At the time this account was recorded, Canada had not been included in that round, and no equivalent meeting between Canada and the United States had yet been announced. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum approached the situation quite differently. Speaking with reporters on July 1st during her daily briefing, she minimized the significance of the review itself. She explained that joint work remains underway and stated that the three countries could still reach an extension agreement at any point during the next decade. That interpretation was noticeably calmer than the messages coming from either Washington or Ottawa. Mexico also has its own reasons for avoiding unnecessary escalation. The practical meaning of these annual reviews deserves attention because many reports become vague precisely where businesses operating cross-border supply chains require clarity. Article 34.7.4 specifies that once the automatic extension is not approved, the Free Trade Commission must meet every year throughout the balance of the original 16-year agreement, continuing through 2036. The purpose of those meetings is either to approve an extension at some future point or to allow the existing timetable to continue. Legal experts at White & Case describe this situation as genuinely uncharted territory because no previous North American trade agreement has ever included this type of recurring review requirement. LeBlanc expressed a remarkably similar view during a Canadian media interview several days after the meeting. He acknowledged that Canada still has no additional certainty regarding how these yearly reviews will actually function, describing the process as somewhat uncharted territory. He explained that he personally asked Ambassador Greer how Washington intended to organize these annual discussions. No answer was provided during the meeting. Instead, both sides simply agreed to continue conversations in the weeks ahead. If Canada's own trade minister publicly says he still does not know how this process will ultimately operate, that alone challenges any claim that Ottawa secured a clear victory. The issue with the greatest immediate importance for Canada's economy is also the point most likely to disappear beneath headlines claiming Canada won. Nothing changed on the ground on July 2nd. Cusma's existing tariff preferences remain fully in place. Its rules of origin continue unchanged. Its investment protections are still active. Its dispute settlement system also remains fully operational. RBC Economics, an analysis published around the time of the review, emphasized that approximately 90% of United States imports from Canada have continued entering the country duty-free because they remain covered by Cusma. This has remained true despite the broader tariff conflict pursued by the Trump administration through Section 232, Section 301, and, until a Supreme Court ruling in February limited its use, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. RBC's own economic modeling indicates that if Cusma protections were ever completely removed, the average effective United States tariff imposed on Canadian exports could approximately double, increasing from about 3.2% to roughly 6.6%. Even then, Canada would still face one of the lower average tariff burdens among America's major trading partners. Nevertheless, such an increase would not be insignificant for the industries with the greatest exposure. RBC identified those sectors as Cusma-exempt automobile parts, machinery, plastics, aluminum products, and wood products, listed in approximately that order according to dollar exposure. None of those changes took effect this week. RBC makes an important distinction that helps explain the current situation. The firm separates a complete termination scenario from what actually occurred. In its view, ending the agreement altogether remains unlikely because North American supply chains have become deeply interconnected over the past 3 decades. What happened instead simply lengthened the negotiating timeline without resolving the underlying disagreements. There's another legal detail that deserves much more attention because it directly challenges the narrative that Washington left with nothing. The opportunity for a 16-year extension did not disappear on July 1st. Under Article 34.7.4, as explained by the trade practice at White & Case, the extension can still be approved at any moment through a written confirmation from all 3 governments. There is no requirement to wait until the following annual review. In other words, no door was permanently closed. The opening remains there, with all 3 governments simply choosing not to move through it yet. That tells a very different story from one side achieving a decisive victory. It is also a far less dramatic story, which may explain why it rarely appears in headlines designed to maximize attention instead of precision. If neither government achieved the victory many headlines suggested, then what actually changed? Several things did. They are simply less obvious than a scorecard would imply. The first change involves the structure of future negotiations. Rather than facing one major decision every 6 years, North American trade policy has now entered a system of recurring annual reviews. LeBlanc himself acknowledged that the format of these reviews remains undefined. Those annual meetings now exist alongside the separate bilateral negotiations already taking place between Canada and the United States over tariffs affecting steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber. Janice Charest, Canada's chief trade negotiator to the United States, has continued working beside LeBlanc on that bilateral effort. Summaries released by Global Affairs. Canada, during the days following July, first showed LeBlanc updating provincial and territorial trade ministers on the review's outcome. During those briefings, he emphasized that Cusma remains completely effective until 2036, while repeating Ottawa's commitment to eventually obtaining the full renewal. The second major change is that Canada must now manage 2 negotiation tracks at the same time without knowing exactly how they will influence one another. One track consists of the annual trilateral review process established under Article 34.7. The other is the more immediate bilateral effort aimed at removing the sectoral tariffs that continue creating the greatest economic pressure for Canadian producers in steel, aluminum, automobiles, and forestry. Regardless of what the agreement itself provides, LeBlanc openly discussed this challenge during his Canadian press interview. He explained that since President Trump returned to office, one of Canada's biggest difficulties has been the uncertainty surrounding these negotiations. According to LeBlanc, Canada's objective is to introduce what he described as some predictability or some rigor into a review system that originated from an American proposal. Mexico's position also deserves attention. Too often, discussions focused on Canada and the United States treat Mexico as though it were merely watching from the sidelines. That is not an accurate description. Marcelo Ebrard released a video statement on July 1st in Spanish explaining that the framework for the annual review process has not yet been established. He also said Mexico is not rushing the negotiations, but it is equally unwilling to remain in extended uncertainty. Mexico already has a confirmed bilateral meeting with the United States scheduled for the week of July 20th in Mexico City. Canada, by comparison, still had no corresponding meeting scheduled at the time this account was recorded. For anyone following actual progress on the tariff disputes, instead of simply monitoring the trilateral review process, Mexico presently appears to have a clearer negotiating path than Canada. That reality stands in contrast to headlines suggesting Canada emerged as the clear winner. None of this should be interpreted as evidence that Canada's position is weak. Moving the narrative all the way to the opposite conclusion would create another oversimplification. Ottawa continues to possess important structural advantages. RBC explains this point directly. Supply chains across North America, particularly in automobiles, machinery, and energy, have reached a level of integration that would make a genuine United States withdrawal from Cusma extraordinarily expensive, not only for Canadian businesses, but also for American manufacturers and consumers. That is one reason RBC continued to view complete termination as unlikely both before and after the review, regardless of political rhetoric appearing in daily news coverage. Market analysts at Conver also reached a similar conclusion before the review. They described the most probable outcome as prolonged negotiations combined with selective concessions, instead of a complete break by either side. Canada's trade minister has likewise made Ottawa's strategy unmistakably clear. The government intends to continue emphasizing Canada's role as what LeBlanc described as a stable, reliable, and trusted trading partner. He pointed to Canada's energy resources, natural resource base, skilled workforce, and what Global Affairs Canada identifies as the strongest investment interest seen in decades as important sources of leverage during the ongoing sectoral negotiations, rather than within the Cusma review itself. The overall conclusion is relatively straightforward. On July 1st, 2026, the United States chose not to approve a clean 16-year renewal of Cusma. Both Canada and Mexico had previously indicated that they supported such an extension. Ambassador Greer's official statement confirmed that decision. As a result, the agreement entered the recurring annual review process established under Article 34.7.4. That process has virtually no precedent. Canada's own trade minister has acknowledged that no settled structure currently exists for how those reviews will operate. Meanwhile, the agreement itself remains completely intact. Its tariff preferences continue unchanged. Its dispute settlement provisions remain active. Its rules of origin also stay fully effective. Those protections will continue through 2036, unless a major change occurs before then. Canada did not secure a concession from Washington during this week's review, nor did it discover any legal shortcut that fundamentally changed the process. Instead, the mechanism written directly into the treaty in 2020 operated exactly as intended after the three governments failed to reach unanimous agreement. The result was to postpone the larger question surrounding Cusma's long-term future, placing it onto a longer path marked by greater uncertainty and recurring annual reviews. At the same time, the separate bilateral disputes involving tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber continue independently. For Canada, those negotiations had still not received a scheduled meeting at the time this account was recorded. There's also a broader pattern connecting this development with other events observed over recent months. That pattern includes the critical minerals partnerships with Europe and Japan, the F-35 procurement review, and the consumer boycott of American goods. The common thread is straightforward. Canada has not been receiving effortless strategic victories. Instead, it has been responding to increasing structural pressure created by a more transactional United States trade approach. Ottawa has used those pressures as motivation to deliberately and often gradually reduce its dependence on Washington by expanding other relationships. The Cusma review follows that same pattern. It represents another example rather than an exception. Perhaps the most significant concern for Canadian policymakers is something LeBlanc openly admitted. No one yet knows exactly what these annual review sessions will eventually look like. Uncertainty of that nature rarely works in favor of a country seeking greater diversification through chance alone. Progress comes from deliberately building alternatives. That has been the focus of Ottawa across multiple policy areas throughout this year. The outcome of this review only increases the urgency of that effort. Looking beyond July 1st also helps explain why this result should not have been surprising. The review process did not appear unexpectedly. Before the meeting ever took place, the United States side was already operating under the USMCA Implementation Act. That law required the United States Trade Representative to consult both the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee before any joint review could occur. It also required public comments to be collected through a formal Federal Register notice. The formal notice began this process on September 17, 2025, roughly 9.5 months before the joint review took place. After that, the Office of the United States Trade Representative organized public hearings from December 3rd through December 5th to collect feedback from industries and other interested stakeholders. A report issued by the Congressional Research Service documenting the process shows that Ambassador Greer met with the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee on December 16th and December 17th. His opening remarks were also released publicly. Even then, he was already indicating the direction the review was likely to take. Greer told members of Congress that the agreement contained shortcomings significant enough that what he described as a rubber stamp renewal would not serve the national interest. He also explained that the success of the review depended upon resolving a series of bilateral and trilateral issues. Those statements were made 7 months before the review meeting itself. The language closely matched the position Washington ultimately announced on July 1st. For anyone surprised by the final outcome, the public record suggests that the Office of the United States Trade Representative had already outlined its position well in advance. It is also important to identify the specific concerns behind the repeated reference to shortcomings. That word carried considerable weight, yet the details often received much less attention. The Congressional Research Service report, together with later statements from the Office of the United States Trade Representative, identified several recurring disputes. These included continuing American concerns over non-tariff barriers involving Canada's dairy industry and other supply-managed agricultural sectors. They also included ongoing disagreements surrounding Canada's digital services tax framework and its treatment of American technology companies. Another continuing concern involved intellectual property enforcement within Canada. On that issue, the 2026 Special 301 report, the annual review covering intellectual property practices among United States trading partners, kept Canada on the agency's watch list. The report cited what it described as continued shortcomings in enforcement, particularly involving border seizures and online piracy. Mexico received different treatment. Within the same report, it was upgraded. The country moved from the more serious priority watch list to the standard watch list. The Office of the United States Trade Representative explained that decision by pointing to substantial progress involving pharmaceutical intellectual property protections, internet service provider liability rules, and criminal as well as border enforcement. That single detail, buried inside a highly technical annual report, helps explain why senior administration officials described Canada and Mexico differently before the review. Whether intellectual property enforcement deserves that level of influence over a trade relationship worth approximately $1 trillion is a separate debate. The important point is that it formed part of the documented case Washington had been assembling throughout much of the previous year. There is another dimension involving Congress that deserves greater attention. The legal structure behind the joint review generated controversy from the moment it became part of the original 2020 agreement. During negotiations over the USMCA Implementation Act, several members of Congress expressed concern that a mandatory sunset-style review could introduce exactly the type of uncertainty capable of discouraging long-term private investment throughout North America. Some lawmakers also questioned whether repeatedly requiring these reviews might weaken Congress's own constitutional authority over trade agreements. At the time, the United States Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer defended the provision. He argued the opposite position. According to Lighthizer, periodic reviews provide Congress with stronger oversight than what he described as permanent trade agreements that never return for reconsideration. 6 years later, that constitutional discussion has become more than theory. Because the review did not produce a clean extension, the Congressional Research Service notes that Congress's future role remains uncertain. Any meaningful revisions to the actual text of Cusma would most likely require fresh congressional approval under United States law. That reality gives Capitol Hill substantial influence over how future annual reviews eventually conclude. Although the reviews themselves are conducted by the Office of the United States Trade Representative together with the trade ministries of Canada and Mexico rather than legislators, RBC Economics identified the same uncertainty in its analysis following the review. The report observed that unless Congress takes additional action, Canada, the United States, and Mexico still have the option of negotiating narrower side agreements that address particular bilateral disputes. Such agreements could resolve specific problems without reopening the entire treaty or requiring another congressional vote. That possibility represents a realistic path away from the present uncertainty. It could also allow every government involved to present a successful outcome without reopening the central question of the 16-year renewal. The review should also be viewed within the larger tariff environment surrounding it. Cusma is not operating independently from the broader trade policies pursued by the Trump administration. RBC directly connected the agreement's continuing importance to sectoral tariff programs implemented separately under Section 232 and Section 301 authority. Those measures operate independently from Cusma itself. During the same period as the joint review, Canada also extended its own tax order covering derivative steel goods. According to Trade Counsel at Macmillan LLP, that decision preserved an exemption for automobile and aerospace inputs that had been scheduled to expire on July 1st. Instead, the exemption was extended until July 1st, 2027. That decision represented a Canadian countermeasure taken independently from the Cusma review. Even so, both developments occurred during the same week. It also demonstrated that Ottawa is not simply waiting for Washington to make every move. Canada continues managing its own tariff policies at the same time. A separate development also occurred this past February. The United States Supreme Court ruled against the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as authority for imposing tariffs. According to RBC, that ruling had relatively little impact on Canada. The reason was straightforward. Most Canada-United States trade had already been flowing through Cusma-compliant channels rather than through the emergency tariff system invalidated by the court. That provides an important correction to another simplified narrative that circulated earlier this year. Many suggested the Supreme Court decision would substantially reduce tariff pressure on Canadian exporters. For Canada specifically, that largely did not happen because Cusma coverage had already been providing that protection. Taken together, these developments present a picture far more complicated than either Canada wins or the United States walks away empty-handed. What actually happened on July 1st was much simpler. A legal mechanism written directly into the treaty 6 years earlier finally reached the point where it had to operate. It unfolded almost exactly as Ambassador Greer's public statements had indicated since at least the middle of December the previous year. There was no clean extension. The agreement entered annual reviews. The treaty itself remained completely in force. Meanwhile, bilateral negotiations over sectoral tariffs accelerated, although Canada still had no scheduled meeting at the time this account was recorded. Those tariffs continue to represent the primary source of economic pressure for Canadian producers. Regardless of what the agreement says about future renewal timelines, Canada's own trade minister has spoken with unusual openness during on-the-record interviews, rather than carefully prepared statements. He acknowledged that his government still does not know how the annual review process will ultimately be organized. Those are not the words of a government celebrating a decisive breakthrough. They reflect a country entering a longer and less predictable phase of negotiations, precisely the outcome Ottawa had hoped to avoid as recently as its June 1st letter sent to Washington. That is where the situation actually stands. Only days after what many described as a deadline, although it was never truly one. This was not a Canadian victory. It was not an American defeat. Instead, it was a treaty mechanism operating exactly as its designers intended, requiring 3 governments to continue another decade of recurring discussions over a relationship none of them can realistically abandon. Each government is still working to determine the conditions under which that relationship will move forward. If you found this analysis valuable, share it with others who want a clearer understanding of North American trade policy. And stay with us for more in-depth coverage of the major geopolitical, economic, and strategic developments shaping today's world. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.